Hi, my name is Caleb Reed. I'm an ag business ranch management major here at TAMUC. Uh, I'll be doing this report on the best grazing practices for cattle. To start off, the question you got to ask is what is grazing and why is it important? The reason why is that it's a sustainable way to feed your livestock that improves your soil health, protects your land from erosion, improves your water quality, and is economically beneficial to you. Some grazing factors is the grazing periods, which is when the periods where you have your animals graze on your land, your rest periods, which is any time that you don't have animals grazing, your soil health, soil organic matter, which is anything that is inside your soil, whether it comes to roots or leaves, your vegetation amount and type, which is the amount of grass or brush you have, water availability, and your stocking rate, which is the amount of livestock or cattle that you have in a pasture grazing at a certain time. Some additional considerations are your factors of production, which are land, labor, and capital. Land is however much land you have, labor is your employees and how much you pay them, and capital is the money you have to do your business. I'm going to be looking over 5 grazing methods, which are rotational, mob, continuous, strip, and adaptive grazing. To start off, rotational grazing is a process of containing your cattle in one section of your pasture, then moving them from paddock to paddock over time. To start off, paddocks are the sections of a pasture that are being grazed. In rotational grazing, there's really only one section or paddock of the pasture grazed at one time, while the rest of the pasture is left alone to rest or regrow its vegetation. In rotational grazing, this is accomplished by moving your cattle from each paddock that hasn't been grazed any more than 50%, allowing enough time for your plants to regrow. Some benefits of rotational grazing is drought management, which lowers the amount of water needed to regrow grasses over time. There's erosion prevention from plants having more time to grow. Soil biomass, cattle training, where cattle get used to the routines you set them through. Your overall herd health from good exercise and correct vegetation consumption. And then nutrient cycling, which allows your nutrients to be taken away and brought back. This is done by your cattle taking away the grasses and enough time for the rest periods to kick in and regrow. Some drawbacks are soil degradation. This is done by cattle compacting the soil by stomping. Biodiversity loss, complexity of management, large initial investment, and higher maintenance cost. Those last three all kind of go together. The complexity of management is from having to move the herd from paddock to paddock. That large initial investment is setting up fences and watering holes. Then the higher maintenance cost is from repairing a fence if it gets destroyed or watering holes if they get damaged. Our next grazing method is going to be mob grazing. Mob grazing is a strategy that was created in South Africa by a man named Alan Savory. It's a technique that's used for small areas of land to be able to have plenty of time to rest and recuperate vegetation in a slower growing climate. It consists of using a large amount of livestock per acre, which is basically just your high stocking rate in a short period of time, and then leaving the pasture to rest for a longer period before grazing it again. Some benefits to start off for mob grazing is reducing grass competition because all cattle are limited to just a small area. There's more of an even distribution of waste. There's higher soil organic matter from stomping down all the food that they don't eat. There's weed management from taking away any undesirable weeds, leading to less money spent on fertilizer or weed eaters, you name it. There's cattle training, just like I said before, in rotational grazing. Some drawbacks are lower amounts of good vegetation, since they're forced to eat everything, and since the cattle are going to favor the good grasses. Then there's lower carbon sequestration. There's lower livestock performance from cattle being forced to eat plants that they otherwise wouldn't eat, leading to lower performance. There's a higher overgrazing risk. It's easy to overgraze, leading to possible use of fertilizers to regrow those grasses. There is high maintenance since there's a daily moving of the cattle. Our next grazing method is continuous grazing. It's probably the first grazing system that was ever used. In this grazing method, the ranchers allow their cattle to graze anywhere they would like in an open pasture for an entire grazing season. It's usually the grazing system that most ranchers most likely will start out with. It's a system that is easy to manage because the hardest decision a manager needs to make is when to let their cattle begin grazing and when to have them stop. Our first benefits are cattle welfare. It's higher cattle welfare just because they're allowed to roam free, leading to low stress. There's less competition for resources since the cattle are allowed to eat and drink wherever they please. Then there's high biodiversity, which leads to higher amount of beneficial wildlife and insects. There's lower use of fossil fuels from there being less amount of maintenance, which equals less amount of machinery, which would equal less amount of fossil fuels. There's a low starting cost just because you just need your basic fence around your land. There's no need for the creation of smaller pastures or paddocks. Then there's low maintenance because you don't have to have any man-made watering holes or small fences. Some drawbacks is an overgrazing risk, since cattle accidentally graze one spot for too long. There's forage underutilization, which leads to that overgrazing risk, where they'll favor certain plants and leave other parts of the pasture alone. Labor and time, since there's more widely dispersed cattle, it'll take more labor and more time to herd all the cattle together and move them. Our next grazing method is strip grazing. In strip grazing, cattle graze in a small strip between two mobile electric fences that are moved once or more a day. Strip grazing is often done with the use of the tumble wheels, which are basically these small circles or wheels that have 6 rods going out from the circle, and then each of those wheels lead with an electric wire to more tumble wheels. It's a very controlled method of grazing. It allows for livestock to have fresh grass to graze every day, and it's easy to move these tumble wheels and move the fence. Some benefits is livestock health. It allows for fresh grass every day, leading to better digestion and lower vet bills. Leads to higher grass growth since only a small amount is grazed every day. There's more consistent grass consumption since there's fresh grass is easier to digest, leading to more consistent consumption. There's lower fertilizer costs since there's faster regrowth of the grasses. Some drawbacks though are fixed water supply necessity. It's just because you have to cut your own water supply and basically make a man-made pond or even just a man-made river going along where you're going to move your electric fence. There's also the chance of water supply damage. With that man-made structure, it's more likely that your cattle can disrupt or damage it with trampling. There's also cattle stress, which can go up from lower physical activity. Then there's the high startup cost, since you have to purchase multiple tumble wheels and electric wire, and also the startup cost of paying for that fixed water supply, as mentioned before. Then there's higher maintenance, since you have to move those wheels multiple times a day. Our last grazing method is adaptive grazing. This has multiple names. Adaptive or generative grazing it's referenced by multiple names like managed grazing or holistic management. There's really no set in stone method when it comes to this. The point of the system is to mirror how herds would act in the wild or act in even a continuous grazing system, but in a more controlled manner. The grazing process consists of controlling the livestock density in each paddock as well as how long the herd is in each paddock based off of pasture conditions. This can be done by essentially creating paddocks within paddocks. The reason the system is also called adaptive grazing is because a manager must adapt to the conditions of the pasture, environment, and herd in a flexible and fluid manner. Some benefits of adaptive grazing is improved soil health, since managers just need to choose how much they want to graze a certain paddock compared to others. It's also higher forage yield, since there is no consistent grazing period per paddock. You get higher yields when resting and grazing periods are properly managed. There's higher carbon sequestration. There's adequate soil compression due to land being constantly covered with cattle trampling, and it leads to more consistent soil compression and even mixing of manure. Some drawbacks are wildlife disruption. Since there's a large amount of human intervention and just a large amount of maintenance being done, it can easily disrupt wildlife. Then there's a large weather dependency. This is due to if there's too much rain on certain paddocks, or if a paddock gets flooded, or even multiple paddocks get flooded, then it can disrupt the flow of rest periods or grazing periods. There's also high maintenance and high startup costs, just like all the others. It's kind of like the mixture of rotational grazing, strip grazing, and everything all in the mix. There's also a high knowledge requirement. If it's not properly controlled, it can kind of destroy the grazing system. Lastly, what I recommend specifically for out of all these grazing methods is rotational grazing. The reason why is that I believe it's a positive baseline that's easy to implement, and it consists of a mix of grazing and rest periods. There's also lower initial investment than basically all of the methods besides continuous grazing, of course. I believe it'd be the best baseline just because it's a great starting position for a grazing management system. It involves a positive mix of letting cattle graze freely in a large portion of land while keeping labor costs moderately low. Although there is a mild initial investment in setting up a rotational grazing system, it is lower than most of the other systems. I feel like rotational grazing takes advantages from each of the other practices while keeping all of its disadvantages pretty low. And that was my technical report and presentation. Thank you.